Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners eager to understand how the theory of these laws works in actual practice. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. I'm your host, Anant Raut. Today's episode is part of our Mergernomics series, produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law Section. This series is intended to help those of us without a Ph.D. in economics understand the economic analyses that go into determining whether a merger could harm competition and should be blocked. Each episode in this series focuses on a particular economic test, tool, or analysis used in merger review. Today's episode is on the diversion analysis. Joining me today as my co-host is Carla Hine, counsel in the antitrust group of the law firm Weil, Gotshal & Manges. Welcome, Carla.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Carla, who do we have on the show today?
Today we have Joanna Tsai, who is vice president and co-head of the mergers investigations practice at the economic consulting firm Cornerstone Research. Joanna is a Ph.D. economist and is an expert in industrial organization and antitrust issues with extensive experience in merger review, and I'm sure is well known to either many listeners or other members of the antitrust section of the ABA. So thanks for joining us, Joanna. To get us started, can you just tell us a little bit about what is diversion from an economic point of view?
Thanks for having me, Carla. It's great to be here on this program. I wanted to start by saying that diversion simply measures the extent to which customers of one firm, such as the merging party, are likely to substitute to a competitor's products or the other merging party's product in response to an increase in price or a decrease in quality. As an example, if Louis Vuitton, for instance, raises the price of its handbags, their customers are probably more likely to substitute to a Gucci handbag or another luxury handbag than they are to substitute to, for instance, a Lululemon sporty handbag, given the differences in their prices, in the use occasions, and other attributes that matter to consumers. In this case, we would say there is a higher diversion from the Louis Vuitton to Gucci than there is to Lululemon. We would want to, of course, examine if that is indeed the case using data. And if so, this type of evidence would suggest that Gucci is a closer competitor to Louis Vuitton than Lululemon is to Louis Vuitton.
That's really helpful. So why is analyzing diversion useful in the context of a merger?
In the merger, we want to understand whether it would substantially lessen competition. That's the key million-dollar question we all want to know. The more directly the parties compete with each other, the more likely there might be a loss of competition when they merge. Diversion is aimed at assessing how intensely the parties compete with each other and understanding whether the merged firms would have the incentive to raise prices after the merger. Firms generally set prices and other terms to try to maximize profits. So in other words, they set prices where the revenue they would earn from raising the price, some is offset by margins from those sales that they will lose as some of their customers substitute to other options. Pre-merger, then firms take into account the risk of losing customers to each other, to other competitors when setting prices. When two firms then merge, they may no longer need to worry about as much losing customers to each other if their customers view them as close substitutes. Therefore, in that case, the firms would be able to raise prices, but the merged firm would still capture at least a portion of that sale. On the other hand, their customers might view other competitors as close substitutes, in which case an attempt to raise prices would be defeated, as it would mean losing customers to those competitors rather than being able to recapture those sales at the margin party firm. In this discussion, I used raising prices as an example, but the same goes to asking the question more generally, whether the merged firm would have the incentive to worsen terms to customers after the merger. Worsening terms might mean raising prices, lowering quality, or reducing innovation, for instance.
So the higher the diversion ratio, or the closer to one that the ratio is, the more likely the combination is to harm competition. I mean, is it really that simple and straightforward though, or are there other factors to consider that, despite what might look like a meaningful diversion ratio, might otherwise temper the suggestion that the merger is likely to harm competition?
You've hit it on the nail and are absolutely right, Carla. It's not that straightforward. There are a variety of other factors that might also change as a result of the merger. And the economists and the agencies consider multiple factors in analyzing the overall competitive effects of a merger. Diversions and how the merging parties' incentives might change after the merger is one factor, but parties operate in a complex environment with others. For example, competitors might reposition or others might enter into the business or the industry. These would affect diversion to the parties and the incentives to raise prices.
I think of diversion analyses as just one of several tools in a broader kind of mergernomic toolkit, if you will. Are there certain kinds of mergers though that are better suited to diversion analyses than others?
Yes, indeed, there are. I typically think of the diversion analyses as particularly suitable for mergers of differentiated products and services, where some products compete more closely with one another while others might be more distant. So, an example of this, of a differentiated products, include handbags, an example I used at the very beginning. Handbags are not all the same, they're not homogeneous as economists would characterize them. Another example is supermarkets. Supermarkets differ in terms of their offerings as well as their location relative to the consumers in terms of how far a consumer would have to travel in order to shop at a Safeway or a Harris Teeter. In industries where market shares are not good representations of how closely or distant the competitors compete, I think, in my opinion, analyzing diversions would be particularly valuable and informative and gives us an additional tool to evaluate the effect that the merger would have on competition, in addition to other information such as number of competitors and market shares.
Joanna, that was really interesting. So, are you saying that in diversion analysis is more useful in a merger where the products are highly differentiated as opposed to where they're, I guess, more commodified?
That's right. Diversions is most effective at measuring closeness of competition. And closeness of competition becomes more relevant when we're in that differentiated products goods industry, where not all products are, equally distant or equally close to each other in terms of their, as I mentioned, their attributes, their features, and typically that means commodities are not, are not qualified, in that industry.
That's really helpful. So we've thought about what kinds of mergers are best suited to this type of analysis. But so let's say you have one of these mergers of differentiated products. When in the process would you normally think about doing a diversion analysis? Like, would you think about it sort of at the planning or risk analysis stages, or more in anticipation of some, a more prolonged review or defense of the merger, or is it more of a sliding scale, all of the above?
It's not, Carla. It's going to depend somewhat on on a variety of factors, on the case and the data availability. Some diversion analyses can be implemented fairly early on in the course of a merger, say based on the win-loss data, which I'll talk about a bit more later. These analyses tend to be relatively simpler and can be done relatively quickly if the data are kept by the merging parties to understand whether and how frequently the parties face competition from each other. Win-loss analysis can be more straightforward compared to others, such as estimating diversions from, say, an entry or an exit event or conducting demand estimation. But it can also depend on the quality of the win-loss data or whether there's a good, clean event to conduct an entry or exit analysis. So I would say the evaluation in terms of the type of diversion analyses one would be able to do, ideally, I think getting started in understanding the industry and competition in that marketplace, discussions with business executives to understand whether there are good, clean events from which to understand diversions would be a useful uh, part of the assessment at the very beginning to understand what would be most informative, but also doable at that early phase. There are times when working with the parties, just to answer your question with respect to the time horizon, when we would typically pursue this type of analysis, there are times when working with the parties, I would conduct this analysis to measure diversion either during the first 30 or 60 days of a merger review or before. And they can be very helpful to the agencies in determining that there's no need for further review or, for example, a second request.
Yeah, that all makes great sense. You mentioned a few different kinds of analyses or ways that you might sort of try to tackle this question of diversion ratios and closeness of competition. And I just want to double click on that a little bit. What are some common types of diversion analyses? You mentioned win loss, you mentioned entry exit events, but if you could just kind of walk us through that, I think that would be really helpful.
So this podcast is probably too short to give a complete description of all common types of analyses economists use. So I will focus on three common ones. Win-loss analyses that we touched upon earlier, the entry and exit analyses, and what I call geographic spatial competition analyses. At the outset, I want to note, too, that the economists at the agencies may conduct these same type of analysis once the merger has been brought to their attention to understand competition between the parties. As the parties' economists, we can help provide these evidence to the agencies. Some businesses keep fairly detailed records of win losses in the ordinary course. Those data are gold mines for economists trying to work out who the companies and which competitors the parties may most compete with. The companies are most likely to systematically track win-loss data if they compete in industries, for example, that compete via submitting bids or RFPs, requests for proposal, or if sales are relatively concentrated with relatively few customers. In these industries, it tends to be more feasible as well as informative to keep track of wins and losses in the ordinary course. However, firms in other industries also might have useful data for this type of analysis. For example, larger firms or firms with dedicated sales personnel might keep win-loss type of data through customer relationship management software like Salesforce, or you might be able to track customer purchase patterns via data gathered through loyalty card programs. Working together, it's, in my experience, always the case that working together with the client and a consulting economist can help you figure out what your client keeps that can be useful for this type of analysis. Once you have the right data, you can then look at whether the merging parties tend to win or lose customers to each other, suggesting that the two parties may have high diversion to each other or tend to win, lose customers to third parties, suggesting that the parties may have low diversions to each other.
How long might an analysis like that take?
Does depend on what data are available and how well they're maintained. To give you an example, if you have great clean data, it can be a very quick analysis. I will go out on a limb and say that it might only take a few days for some quick takeaways. But on the other hand, if extensive data cleaning is required, or if there are significant gaps in the data that require speaking or confirming with the client, or if matching between data sets is required, you could be looking at a couple of weeks to closer to a month.
Thank you for that. Thinking about, I think you had also mentioned entry or exit analyses and sort of a natural experiments around those types of events. What are you looking at there, and how does that analysis unfold?
Absolutely. In some cases, it might be that one of the merging parties introduced a new competing product in recent years, or that one of the merging parties began to compete with the other merging party in a segment of the market or a geographic region that it did not compete in before. So in these cases, the entry or exit can be thought of as a type of natural experiment that can be used to estimate how closely the two merging parties compete. If they compete closely, you would expect that most of the demand for the new product to have come from or come at the expense of the other firm. Their customers substitute it away from their product and towards the new product. However, if they're not close competitors, then most of the demand for the new product would likely have come from other competitors or would be new demand, leaving the demand for the first party's product relatively unaffected. So when you have an entry or exit event like this in the relevant market, that tells us a lot about the extent of competition between the merging parties versus how each competes with other competitors in the industry.
What kind of data would you use for that type of analysis? I mean, is it simply dollar or unit sales from the newly entered product, for example, or the newly entered region, or is it something else? And similar to what we talked about before, I mean, what's the time horizon on that you're looking at as well for that kind of data?
That's a great question, Carla. And we get asked that a lot, and clients typically look to us fairly quickly to understand what type of data and for what time horizon do we need for this analysis so that they can begin to think about how they would pull such data and for how long. I would say for this type of analyses that we have been describing and discussing, unit sales is the best rather than dollar sales. Dollar sales can give a more, the reason is that dollar sales can give more mixed signals as prices may be changing as well for reasons that are unrelated to the event that we're studying. As for the time horizon, I typically look at 3 to 12 months prior and after the event, longer if we're able to obtain such data easily. The key thing we want to make sure is that we have long enough time period to look at different time horizons to make sure that the conclusion we draw from this are not sensitive to our selection of the time horizon. If you do have an entry or exit event, depending on the data you have and how complicated the market is, you're probably looking at a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks for a first pass on a simpler, clean analysis, with more time being needed for a more complicated analysis when, for example, there are confounding events that would require more care to ensure that we're not over or underestimating the impact from the event. So in practice, I would say this type of analysis is likely to come further along in the merger review rather than, say, early days of risk analysis.
We talked about win-loss analysis. We talked about entry and exit events, and you also mentioned geographic or spatial competition analyses. Can you walk us through that?
Sure, Carla. These are analyses that make more sense in certain industries. For example, those that involve high transportation costs to deliver products or services to customers. Some examples of these industries include cement or industrial gas, sometimes chemicals as well. In these industries, you can get a lot of information about how close the firms are competitive with each other by simply observing how close they are physically. Let me break down what I meant by that a little more. In these industries, your distance to customer is an important component in the cost of delivering your product and is therefore an important component in competition among firms. All else equal, if you are farther away, you're going to have higher transportation costs in order to deliver or service those customers, and thus may be less price competitive than your competitors who are located closer to the customer. Now, let's say you merge with a competitor. If you're both located close to the same customers and there are no other nearby competitors, you might be able to profitably raise your prices to those customers a fair bit because you know that their other options are located further away and are therefore likely to be a lot more expensive. However, if a third party is also nearby, or if there is a lower cost producer that even though that producer is located further away, but because it has lower costs otherwise with manufacturing the product or whatnot, they might be able to still ship to the customer competitively for longer distances. Then you're going to be more constrained in how um, the merging parties can raise prices in that instance. An economist can analyze the location of the merging parties via their customers and determine whether or not and which customers would likely face a price increase post-merger.
So recognizing that every industry has its own sort of particularities and idiosyncrasies, what kind of data would you typically need or use for that sort of analysis? And again, over what sort of time horizon are you looking at?
Conducting this analysis requires information on the merging parties' locations, customer locations, other rivals' locations, and estimates of production and freight delivery costs for both merging parties and rivals. Um, if the product delivery relies on terminals and rail, um, which um, which was the case in a few of the mergers that I've been involved in, then you'll also need to consider that in estimating the freight and delivery costs to the customers. It sounds like it sounds complicated and sounds like more data that is necessary, but it's trust me, it can be done and it's part of the exercise of estimating the overall cost of transportation. Depending on the number of supplier and customer locations, the data, computation, and time requirements for this analysis can be significant. One option that can sometimes be very helpful to contain costs as well as amount of time that's required for this analysis is to only conduct an analysis on a sample of customers in selected regions. So, for example, if you choose the sample carefully, you can often say a lot about the entire market or important segments of the market while significantly reducing the cost and the time of the analyses.
Is similar to the entry and exit analysis. Is this geographic or spatial competition analysis? Is this sort of similar in terms of when you might deploy something like this? In other words, are you thinking about this more when you're in the throes of a second request or in the middle of advocacy to defend against the deal, rather than something that you're doing sort of earlier in the process?
Typically, yes, given the data requirements that I mentioned and the level of detail, typically it is the case that this particular type of exercise is likely to come further along in the merger review. On the other hand, there are also instances where, because this type of analysis would take longer to complete, sometimes the client would like us to start earlier in order for them to be completed, you know, on time before reaching the next significant the next significant process in the merger review.
And this has been, I think, a really helpful introduction. And I know we don't have time for a super deep dive on this format, but just by way of introduction to our listeners, are there other diversion analyses that their consulting economists might consider for them?
Yes, absolutely. There is one other important analysis I want to mention that I have not covered yet, and it is demand estimation. It is a common tool for consumer packaged goods mergers in part due to the availability of scanner data that allows us to track how demand for particular products changes when price changes. It essentially allows economists to estimate what is known as cross price elasticities, which is a measure of how the sales of one product changes in response to the price changes of another competing product. The cross price elasticities can provide a very good input into diversions between a set of products, including the merging parties' products.
Joanna, you said that diversion analysis is useful in determining whether a merger could lead to a worsening of terms. Worsening of terms could be a raising of prices post-merger, but at the top of the show, you said that it could also be a decrease in quality of the product. Does the diversion analysis tell you along which parameter of competition might be impacted post-merger, or does it just say, and maybe this is based on like the inputs that you're using for these analysis you've discussed, or does it just say, hey, we can't tell you how the terms might be worsened for customers, but we can just tell you based upon the closeness of how they compete that is likely to impact some parameter of competition?
That's right, Anant. It doesn't, the diversion analysis doesn't tell us how some of these worsening of terms could come about. Um, the worsening of terms is a way, it's a tool that we use to think about, what are the bad outcomes that could occur with a reduction of competition. And so, what is a bad outcome? A bad outcome would be if prices go up, if consumers have to pay higher prices, right? A bad outcome would be if services deteriorate, the quality of the services deteriorate, or the quality of the products deteriorate. And so it's a in some sense an exercise. It's a exercise to think about, whether there would be incentives by the merging parties part to worsen those terms for the consumers. Um, and because we don't know exactly, and it could be any of those ways where terms could be, you know, parties could effectuate, some worsening of terms. We kind of go through these different ways in order to ensure that we are thinking about this correctly. We're capturing what is most relevant in the particular industry that we're studying.
Thanks for that, and appreciate that question as well. I think we've talked a lot about not just the types of analyses that you do, but also when you do them over the course of a merger review. And so I would commend to any interested listeners out there Joanna's 2019 article in the ABA Antitrust sections, the Antitrust Source. It's called "The Role of Economic Analyses in Preparing for the First 30 Days of a Merger Review." And it's just got a bunch of really great useful information for anyone interested in what happens during those early stages of a merger review. I just wanted to make sure I got that in there as well for folks, for everybody else's further reading. Finally, I think, Joanna, how should we think about diversion analyses, in the context of a merger review?
Yeah. So I want to note that for today's discussion, I have laid out the general approaches to each type of these uh, diversion analysis, but there is no cookie cutter approach to any of these. Each merger will have its own idiosyncrasies and features based on, among other things, the way competition works in the particular industry and the manner in which the data is kept by the parties and the scope of the and quality of the data kept. In addition, one important limitation of all of the analyses I've discussed today is that they all take a relatively static view of the market post-merger. So that is, they don't consider potential for other firms to react to the merger, say by introducing new products or entering new markets. They also don't account for the possibility the merged firm may be more efficient or better able to compete. In some mergers, the possibility of such entry or efficiencies can be an important part of assessing the overall effect of a merger on competition. And to assess these, you often need additional analyses aimed at capturing the dynamic features of the industry. And it's just a bit harder when you no longer restrict yourself to a static view of the market. But it's an important perspective. And even if you think the market is flush with new entrants and your merger is going to unlock all sorts of synergies, it can often still make sense to start with a quick and simple diversion analysis. Depending on what you find with that analysis, you might not even need a more complicated or involved analysis.
So, Joanna, Carla, what are the key takeaways here for practitioners?
I'll kick off. From my perspective, I mean, I found this conversation just really important and useful. But also highlights that diversion ratios are really, to me, just one more tool in a larger economic or mergernomic toolbox. They can be, in my experience, they can be really useful in showing closeness, or more importantly, sometimes lack thereof of closeness of competition. But they're not for every situation, and where they may be meaningful, they don't necessarily tell the whole story either. So it's, just use them cautiously depending on how you want to use them, I guess. Joanna, what about you?
I agree. I mean, diversions is one type of analysis in the overall scope of merger review analyses. It can be very useful if I think done correctly. On the other hand, I think there are various ways of conducting such diversion analyses. I would recommend that at the outset, if you're in the early stages of a merger, to start with a simpler estimate of diversions, and then as the deal progresses, as you learn more about the deal, refine from there, as opposed to jumping in right at the outset with one of the more involved analyses.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Carla, for another excellent episode in our Mergernomics series and this edifying explanation of how diversion analysis works. To our listeners, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.